Hi folks, this is Ela, and I'm going to talk about how to do a landscape with glazing technique. What that means is I first start with some very diluted paint in my very first layer. And I did let the sky dry before I did this green part below. I avoided anything that I wanted to keep white. You're allowed to keep some white in wherever you want it to stay. But you're not starting with dark colors. You're not starting with small shapes. You're starting with big, general, pale shapes. And you can see I did some wet into wet technique in that first layer, letting that brown and that green blend together. And once that very first layer dries, then you can go in with your next darker layer. You can let that dry again, and then you can go in with your shadows or whatever is darkest in your picture. So watch me as I demonstrate how I painted this picture. So as you can see here, I have a very pale pencil drawing of the landscape that I'm going to paint. And you are free to leave out anything you want. I'm leaving out this big barricade right here, and I'm focusing on the top half of the page. And these pencil lines are mostly just reminders of where things are going to go. We're not getting too uptight with this picture. We're keeping it kind of loose. So first thing I got to do is I have to mix my colors. And if you have a green and a blue that you want to use, that's fine. But also, don't be afraid to mix your own colors. And I'm actually going to mix my colors today. You can see I have a very small palette. I have two blues. I have a red and a yellow. And this is the ultramarine blue. So these are my options. It's important to know, what do your colors look like, and learn the names of each color. This is phthalo blue. It's a very greenish blue. It'll make a really good green. This is ultramarine. It has some red in it. It makes purples really well. And then we have a quinacridone rose over here. Kind of a purplish red. So these two would make purple really well. And then this is transparent yellow, which is a fairly flexible yellow that it can make an orange, it can make a green, it can do whatever you want. Now I say make a good green or make a good purple. What I mean is it will make an intense green. So the question is, do you really want a green that's gonna look like this? It's actually pretty good. Sometimes it can be a little bit too intense. Sometimes it can look kind of highlighter green. Another important thing to know is this is a very powerful blue. You see how it just took over that yellow, and I can't even see it anymore. So if you haven't played around with mixing your colors and finding out what they do together, by all means, sit down and just play with mixing all of your colors and seeing what happens if you combine a red, a yellow, and a blue, and what happens in between. It's going to be different depending on the colors that you choose. So I'm actually going to mix some colors in my palette now. And you want to make sure that you make enough. You don't want to run out of your color. So we know we're going to need a lot of yellow. I find that especially beginning students get really impatient with mixing colors. But then once they really start to get the hang of it, then it becomes their favorite part of the painting. And it is an extremely important part of making your picture. I find that if you always reach for whatever color comes in your palette, then the different parts of your painting will feel kind of disjointed and childish. I mean, here's a little example I actually did before. Here's a brown that I got out of the palette and a green that I got out of the palette. And you can see how this tree feels much more unified than this tree. Maybe you like this, but if you want your tree to feel like all the parts exist in the same universe, this one has much more of that quality. It looks more natural. So I've got this yellow here. I'm mixing my green. I'm going to go straight for the phthalo blue. I'm going to wipe some of that off my brush before I dip it in there, because I know it's strong. I could add a little bit more at a time until I get the color that I want. Let's see, that's really pale. I want it to be a little darker than that. I'm gonna put more yellow in there. I don't always clean my brush. My brush is not super dirty right now. And I'm gonna grab this from down here. I'm gonna throw a little bit of that back in again. So I'm adding a whole bunch of yellow and a tiny bit more blue. I'm tiptoeing up to the color I want. That's more concentrated. I think that's probably good enough. I can go ahead and paint my landscape that green. If I want to get some of that brown in, actually I'm thinking I should probably get some of that brown in. I can start over here. I'm going to do the same process again. I'm going to go with the same two colors, but I'm going to add a tiny bit of red, and that will make brown. You can get brown from any combination of red, yellow, and blue. You're just going to have more of the red and yellow and less of the blue. Brown is just orange with a little blue in it. I grab some of this blue, and now I'm going to grab some of that red. I'm going to wipe some of that off. The red is not nearly as strong as that. You notice I'm not rinsing my brush a lot. Every time I rinse my brush, I'm adding more water. If I'm not, that's beginning to look like brown. I think that's probably fairly pale. That's getting into brown. Let's put some more yellow. You can see why I run out of my yellow first. I probably go through more yellow than any other color because it is so weak. Okay, that is looking much more yellow. We're getting in there. I'm going to put some of that red back in as well. Bring it farther from yellow and more into orange. There we go. I like that. That works. I'm going to start with the green. I'm rinsing that brown off my brush. I'm drying off my brush so I don't accidentally put water in there. This is a small picture, but it's a very textured paper, so it's going to use up a lot of paint. And I'm going to use this brush. I want to use at least an 8 or a 10, something not small. And I'm looking up at this as I paint. So I'm thinking, where do I want to have these areas of brown? I'm working very quickly. I'm not stopping and staring for long periods of time off in the distance. I'm not running to the bathroom. I am immediately coloring in my picture. If I need to tilt it up, I can tilt it up. But you can see there's a lot of texture. And if I want any dry brush, it's really easy to do. If I want really smooth areas, I have to make sure my brush is really wet. I'm not wiping it in between strokes. I'm going straight in there. Dry it off. I'm not even going to rinse it. I'm just going to go straight in here because that green is already in here already. I can go ahead with my brown. Doing wet into wet technique here. If I feel like it's not showing up as much as I want, I can take out some of that green. And I can put in more of that brown. That's pretty good. If there's any, you see this is all paint. I'm gonna remove that bead of paint. It's a little bit much. It's gonna create a dark line if I leave that. So now I just need to leave this alone, let it dry for a few minutes. So I'll see you once it's ready for the next layer. So this is now dry. I let it sit and dry for a few minutes, and then I hit it with my hair dryer. And the question is, what am I going to do with the sky? If I look at my reference photo, I can see it's kind of an overcast day, but I'm just going to stick with what I have in this palette here. So I think I'm going to make it a little bit more bluish. And if I wanted to stick with the theme of really just using 3 colors and nothing more, I could just add water to this and see what I think. Let's see. Whoop. What does that look like? Is that the right color? That's kind of deep. By adding, I could make it more pale by adding more water. If I want to make it less greenish and more of a neutral blue, let's see what that looks like. I could actually add a tiny bit of red to it, so it would be closer to an ultramarine sort of a color. So yeah, it's going to make it more purplish, but a little bit will be okay. Just a little bit. So you can see I touched a little bit and then I wiped some of that red off. I'm really tiptoeing up to that color. I only need a tiny bit. So that's just a little bit softer, a little bit closer to a grayish kind of color. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more water again. I want it to be pale. This is my first layer. I want it to be, this is paler than this. So I want this color to be paler than this. So let's take a look and see. That's still too dark. So there's a lot of patience and planning involved when you're painting with watercolor in this sort of traditional sort of way. That's getting closer. It's going to dry paler than it looks as well. These green swatches have already dried, so let's see. I could also even rinse my brush out. There we go. That's getting close to what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and just start painting this, and actually like some of these white light areas. And so I'm going to purposefully let some of those stay, especially higher up in the sky. I'm going to go a little bit more solid closer to the land. And it's okay if it overlaps the land a little bit. I can always touch it up with a paper towel. I can also create a cloud by rinsing out my brush and just putting some clear water on there. And the clear water is going to push against that paint and create sort of a softer, more cloud-like appearance. I think I only want just a little bit of that dry brush. So now that needs to dry, and then I can begin to put in my trees. So now I am going to paint these dark trees, and they're going to be layered on top of this picture, which is now dry. And I want to make sure that these colors are more intense. So I have put some water in the yellow and I let it soak for a little bit. And, you know, there's not very much that I need to paint. I don't need a ton of paint. So I'm just going to put the yellow directly from the pan. You know, I've really made sure that it's dissolved and that it's concentrated, because I want this to be a deep, intense color. And now I can maybe take a little bit of this purpley color, because I don't want a bright green. I want it to be more of a, brownish, sort of a piney green. And I can go and just grab a little bit of that blue, not rinsing out my brush. And then every step of the way, I'm constantly testing it out. That's not bad, actually. To really make sure that I've got all the color on my brush mixed in. You can see I have a lot less of it, but it's much more concentrated than this stuff, right? Much darker than this was. I can actually get something that looks like a tree. If you want, you can also try layering. What does that look like? Because you've swatched it beforehand. So now I can go ahead with my reference photo, start coloring it in, and it's not going to be exactly like up there, but it's going to be similar. So this is my second layer. And that texture is going to work in our favor because we're having big kind of bushy shapes. Right? We're not drawing little circles. There's no little perfect little shapes in there. If I want to put more brown in there later, I can. Just kind of touching the brush and moving it around. I could mix more than one green if I wanted to, but I'm keeping it quick and fast for you guys. I can barely see my drawing, but that's okay. And don't worry if you can see the pencil lines. They're not going to be a big deal. It's a loose picture. Let's see what's going on here. So I'm keeping this really simple. I'm keeping it fairly monochromatic. But you can add more colors if you wish. So if I want to go even deeper, if I want to do some wet to wet, I can. Got this dark green that I made previously. I can just jump in there with that. And just remember that any shadows are on the underside and in the deepest parts of the tree. They're not at the top. They're much farther down. I'm going fast, so I'm not really separating these two areas from each other, but I can kind of do a little bit in between there. I'm having fun. I can define things a little bit more here. I can make little horizontal lines to suggest shadows, right? This is on a hillside. These shadows are actually at a diagonal. So there it is. That's a simple, quick composition. If I wanted it to dry, I could do another layer on top, but I think I'm going to stop there. So that's how you do a watercolor landscape with glazes.